Hey, I'm Rachel,
And I'm Amanda, and this is Beyond a Ballot.
powered by DoorDash. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Beyond a Ballot. Today, we're talking about something every government eventually faces, but very few are truly ready for. A first-year report card. Because just over a year ago, Mark Carney stepped into office with a level of credibility we almost never see in Canadian politics. Former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a global economic figure, someone who built a reputation not just on politics, but on competence. And he came in at a moment where Canadians were, and still are, feeling real pressure. The cost of living, housing, economic uncertainty, and a growing sense that the system isn't quite working the way that it should. The promise, implicit and explicit, was this: if anyone could steady the ship, it would be Mark Carney. So now, 1 year in, the question is, who is Mark Carney? How is he governed? And has the economic credibility translated into political leadership? Are Canadians meaningfully better off than they were a year ago? And maybe most importantly, has he been bold enough for the moment or just too cautious? To break down all of these questions, we are joined by two people who understand both the theory and the reality of how government decisions get made. First, Kate Harrison, Vice Chair at Summa Strategies. Kate is one of the country's leading voices on political strategy and public affairs, with deep experience inside of government. She served in senior roles in Ontario's government, including as Director of Stakeholder Relations to the Deputy Premier, giving her a front row seat to how policy is shaped, negotiated, and communicated at the highest levels. Today, she advises major organizations on navigating government and is a regular national media commentator known for her clear-eyed, no-spin analysis of politics. Also with us is Supriya Dwivedi, an economist and public policy expert who has worked at the intersection of government and data and real-world impact. She's advised on major economic and social policy files, including affordability, labor markets, and fiscal policy, and brings a rare ability to translate complex economic decisions into what they actually mean for Canadians day to day. She's also a former advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Her work sits at the critical intersection of evidence, policy design, and political reality. Supriya and Kate join us now. Hi, guys.
Hello. How are you?
Well, I'm great. We are thrilled to have both of you, powerhouses and just brilliant minds, with us today as we try and dissect the last year of the Mark Carney government. I cannot believe it's been a year already. But here we sit at a little late. I think the anniversary was last week. But I want to dive in and kind of just get your initial reaction, your initial reflection on the year that has been in the Carney government. Maybe I'll start with you, Supriya.
Sure. So, I mean, look, there are aspects of the Prime Minister's first year in office where I would honestly give him an A+. But then there are other aspects, I would say, particularly as it pertains to the domestic kind of legislative agenda. So, you know, the laws that the Carney government is pushing through Parliament, where he barely gets a passing grade. So in the most general terms, and I recognize this will sound very simplistic and almost reductive, but I think in general, the PM tends to do much better internationally and is seemingly more comfortable or at ease with international media than he is with domestic media. Ditto for like international events, et cetera, et cetera. And at least it appears that way. And the two things that kind of highlight for me the most were, of course, his Davos speech, right? Everyone has heard of it. Everyone is like, woo, is amazing, right? Accolades, world leaders, press, everybody fawning.
And I then play it for my kids every night before bed. Yeah.
That's exactly. A great idea.
There you go.
Sleep. Good.
Right. But then you juxtapose that, you know, that Davos speech just a few days later, where, you know, he's in Quebec City. And he referred to the Plains of Abraham as kind of being the jump off point of Canadians coming together and choosing unity, which, you know, I grew up in Quebec. I'm a Quebecer. It's just like laughably incorrect from that perspective, right? And it was notably panned by Quebec media and commentators. So it's that juxtaposition of his like international, very well received speech in Davos with his misstep in Quebec City that I find so fascinating, because like one of those things is much harder than the other, right? But he managed to screw up the arguably the much easier thing.
Kate, what are your reflections from the last?
I think Supriya makes a lot of great points. It reminds me a little bit of the 2015 Love-In with former Prime Minister Trudeau, where he took the international stage and there were Vanity Fair covers and there was all this international praise for his new leadership. Less magazine covers in Mark Carney's instance, their case, which is fine, I think. I think there's an obvious departure there. And maybe that's one of the most successful components of this Prime Minister's leadership so far from Canadians' perspective. Like, he's an obvious break from the decade of leadership before, at least in terms of how he's presenting himself optically. So lots of international fanfare, but I would say more geared towards substance than style, like we saw under Justin Trudeau. What I think Mark Carney is doing very well right now is reassuring Canadians that things are going to be okay. This is a very challenging world, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that the Prime Minister, to his credit, has been able to convey to Canadians that he's the right guy to manage these turbulent times. Now, I'm sure, as we'll discuss, how is he actually managing them in terms of, to Supriya's point, domestic policy, even some of the international trips, like what is it resulting in terms of material and tangible benefit? I think that's the subject rightly of quite a bit of debate. But what I think he has done and deserves a passing grade for on this front is conveying to Canadians that he's competent leadership at a time where that is needed. How long that lasts, I think, is a matter of discussion.
Okay, so it's been a year. A lot has happened. It's hard to even think back to the federal election. But if you had to choose, what was the single biggest expectation Canadians had when they elected him as Prime Minister, and has he met that expectation? I'm curious about your thoughts on that. And Kate, this time we'll start with you.
So this might not shock anybody. I'm going to say no, because the biggest expectation that I think the Prime Minister had in the last election was to course correct and manage the relationship with the United States and with Donald Trump specifically. And we can have a debate about whether or not strategically lying low and kind of letting the current deal play out may actually be what is in Canada's best interest. I think we could have a debate about that. But on the matter of being elected to fix this relationship, we do not seem to be much farther ahead in that regard than we were when the Prime Minister took office. There's been tariffs applied to key sectors and industries. We have heard just news in the last week that Canada is falling behind Mexico in terms of the status of our trade negotiation, at least according to the U.S. Trade Representative. So in terms of what he was elected to do, in terms of his words, secure a new economic and security partnership with the United States, we are, from my estimation, we are not farther ahead. Is that all Mark Carney's fault? No, of course it's not. It's also because of who's in the White House. But it was the Prime Minister that got elected to fix that. And from a material perspective, there's not much new there to report.
Supriya?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't disagree with that. We clearly don't have this tariff-free deal, right? And CUSMA renegotiations are on their way. But I would say that I'd quibble just slightly with that, because I do think it matters who's in the White House. And I do think it matters that we're dealing with somebody that is not only fundamentally kind of unpredictable and flies by the seat of his pants, but will literally say one thing one day and then, say something else the next. So even if we were to ink a new deal, I mean, the runway for that New Deal is anybody's guess. The current deal that we're in the throes of renegotiating, and that the American side is, hell bent on sort of throwing away into the wind, was negotiated by the president himself, right? Mm-hmm. So I think for me, I think where the prime minister does exceptionally well is kind of this whole like keeping calm and carrying on. And I can certainly understand why conservatives are right to point out that there isn't necessarily a packaged, with a bow on it deal right now for Canadians to look at. But I think in the grand scheme of things, he is working with what he's got. And I think he's doing a pretty darn good job.
I want to talk about Mark Carney's leadership style, because you talked about, Kate, the covers that Justin Trudeau did of Vogue magazine and the way that they packaged him and his leadership. That's very different from what we're seeing from Mark Carney, who is, some have described him as leading the country like a CEO instead of a politician. Yeah. Can you give us your thoughts on how he has changed leadership in the PMO?
I think that's been one of the biggest changes in the city and in government in terms of how things operate. I do observe a couple similarities in effectively kind of core decision making being concentrated in a few key individuals. The difference that I would observe is that the individuals that were responsible for a lot of the decision making in the Trudeau administration were firmly from politics. They understood kind of the importance of retail politics and what it meant for your election prospects. That's not really the case right now with this current PMO. You see a lot of business and finance advisors coming in, providing their perspective. Mark Carney has contracted a lot of big jobs out to friends from private industry and the head of major projects and the Defence Investment Agency and Build Canada Homes, all of these, government adjacent bodies that have big responsibilities, but they're being led by people in most instances that don't understand kind of the value of retail politics. I think that one of Trudeau's strengths was caucus relations and management. Of course, he had to do a fair bit of it in his time in office, and it wasn't perfect. But I don't know that Mark Carney thinks about caucus at all. Whereas Trudeau was really in the trenches when he first came in 2013, again, the third place party, or the fourth place party. He was one of them who kind of came up and led. Mark Carney had a cakewalk for the leadership. And there's a lot of people that are around that, he's the leader, but are they really his people? And is he really like the captain of a team, or is he the CEO of a business? And I think that might be something that becomes more challenging for the prime minister as time goes on, because politics is very much a team sport, and that dynamic matters.
Supriya?
Yeah, again, I hate to do this, but I agree with Kate. Look,
we love it.
I think there is something to be said about coming from the business world, the financial world, and treating everything as though it's like a CEO and then, at some point shareholder relationship. And that's not really how you go about things. And that you've seen instances where this has happened and it's, played out publicly. I think a good example for your audience would be when he had a call with President Trump, and Canadians found out about it because Scott Bessent, who is a Trump official, was on Fox News talking about it. Mm-hmm. And that's the first time. And one thing you'll hear constantly from the Ottawa Press Gallery is that this PMO is very reticent to put out readouts of conversations that the Prime Minister has had with other world leaders. And look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like readouts are giving all the juicy details of what has happened in the conversation, but it at least provides an information or a data point for Canadians and the media to be able to be like, oh, okay, they spoke. All right. And then it allows, a journalist to straight up ask him, well, what did you talk about? And right before he had that call with President Trump, he had told a journalist who had asked the question when the last time he spoke to Trump was. He said it was a silly question or what a ridiculous question. I don't remember the exact phrasing, but, essentially he was incredibly dismissive of it. So that to me is very much a CEO type of attitude of like, I don't really have to deal with this. And then you also see, he tends to get a little bit prickly with his back and forth with journalists, more often than not with female journalists, right? That to me also isn't exactly, good politics, team sports, retail politics, whatever. It's more of that CEO kind of mindset. And to be clear, I'm sure there are multiple instances where having that sort of CEO mentality works quite well. I'm sure it improves efficiency. I'm sure it's better for workflow in some cases. But when you're dealing with, actual human beings and people, it might not always be the best approach. And I've said this before, not on this program, but on others, where I think he's very clear he has a very high IQ, but his EQ or his emotional quotient for people, I don't know if it's all the way up there.
And now, word from our title sponsor, DoorDash. We're proud to share that Beyond a Ballot continues to be powered by DoorDash. Just like we go beyond a ballot, DoorDash goes beyond delivery. Over the past few weeks, we've shared stories from two Dashers in Canada, Beverly and Sindhu. Beverly is retired and dashes alongside her husband in Simcoe, Ontario. Sindhu arrived in Burnaby, British Columbia as an international graduate and started dashing while establishing roots in a new city. Their goals for dashing are different, but the flexibility to decide when and how they earn remains the same. For Beverly, that means creating a routine that fits retirement and family life. For Sindhu, it means balancing school, a new city, and earning income on her own schedule. Different goals, the same flexibility. DoorDash is helping dashers like Beverly and Sindhu achieve their financial goals, empowering them to do it on their own terms.
Okay, I want to go back to something that you both mentioned in your analysis right off the top, and that was the mark that he's made on the international stage versus some of the things that you believe he hasn't moved forward on the domestic stage. And you can take your policies of choice, whether it's related to cost of living and affordability, housing, climate, energy. Despite all of that, he enjoys a really high favorability amongst Canadians, and he's attracting members, which you may or may not agree with, from other parties, bringing him just a seat or two away from a majority. If he's not moving policy forward domestically, what is working so well in the eyes of Canadians and those members who are crossing the aisle?
Vibes.
Vibes.
There is a lot of vibes. Yeah. And I think I spoke to the comfort and reassurance. I think Canadians right now want to be protected. I really think that we're also in an era right now where it's not about liberal or conservative or left and right for many people. Like, most people don't actually think that way, like normal people, not like, the four of us. But like,
not like us.
But it's like, what do you want the role of government to be? Do you want to have agency over yourself and choose your own future and have your say, or do you want government to be there to support you? And I think, conservatives would more likely fall into the former camp. But a larger majority of Canadians are falling into the latter, particularly when there's so much that's happening that is like really beyond the control of what's happening in our borders. So I do really think that the Prime Minister has been effective in conveying a steady hand. I think it was Supriya who said, keep calm and carry on. I just question when that is going to hit the reality of people's gas prices and grocery bills, not even staying status quo, but going in the opposite direction. Vibes don't pay the bills, and we're not in a better place financially. Many people are not in a better place financially than they were a year ago. So again, I think time is not favorable for the Prime Minister as he tries to navigate all of these dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, time seldom is anybody's friend for the most part. But I would just go even one step more granular than that with respect to the vibes observation, because if people were to actually drill down on some of those problematic bills that I've referred to on the offset, I don't know if the vibes would match, right? Let me give you an example. The Strong Borders Act, or Bill C-2, which parts of it have been reintroduced as Bill C-22, the Lawful Access Act. There's some absolute batshit crazy stuff in there, which allows for basically a surveillance state, allowing the public safety minister to demand any messaging app, email provider, social media platform, cloud service, essentially to backdoor engineer access for law enforcement directly into their own infrastructure, all while Canadians are kept in the dark. And companies that, end up receiving that request can't tell their users, and there's no judicial oversight here. So again, now the government will say they're only going after criminals, but you can't do that with encryption. That's not how that works, right? Essentially, once you engineer this surveillance capability into your infrastructure and into your systems, it doesn't only magically exist for law enforcement. It exists for everyone and forever. So this basically becomes this permanent backdoor for criminals and hostile state actors to use to their advantage. And then the extra silly thing about this, just to get one level nerdier, is that this happened in the UK, and it drove the US absolutely nuts, because there were a critical mass of US House and Senate Republicans that don't want any weird backdoor encryption breaking, and they used it as a sticking point regarding trade with them, to the point where pressure from Trump officials like Tulsi Gabbard and others got the UK to drop its hold encryption breaking measure. So I'm really not sure why the Carney government is pursuing this as we get into CUSMA renegotiations. And then there's all sorts of other things, like the Build in Canada Act, which again was really great for vibes, right? We got to build things faster, projects of national interest, like rah. Okay. But that also meant that cabinet could exempt laws. So they could just ignore environmental laws. And again, the bill hasn't been used to build any projects of national interest. So, and it's facing lawsuits from, a bunch of, I think there's over a dozen Ontario First Nations and from the Quebec Environmental Law Center. So again, not great. And
if you're gonna make those big bets on legislation that comes with political risk, the reward to the risk needs to be nearer term than what a lot of the things this government is seeking to do. Like, they're not going to realize kind of the pleasure from that pain in the term of this government. It's very unlikely, right? So, it's the same thing with the governance style. If you're going to lead government like a CEO, you have to make some ballsy calls that are not going to be popular, but within 12, 18, 24 months, you're seeing the benefit of that risk. Government really doesn't move that way. And I would say that the Prime Minister, despite, I think of Supriya raised some good examples. I think of the Alberta pipeline as another example, right? So you have this splashy announcement. You don't take away any of the legislation that underpins other projects from getting off of the ground. And so you've got the optics of a pipeline maybe someday proceeding, but there's other proponents out there being like, okay, that doesn't benefit us at all. We are not any further incentivized to invest with Canada, because you've still got this foundation of bad legislation. So it's just like tinkering with the margins in a way that optically looks interesting and different from the last administration, and it's in a new package. And so that's interesting to people. But how much is actually being achieved? Debatable.
So you touched on, the pipeline, security, surveillance. Like, these are things that we typically talk about when we talk about conservative governments who look at these issues maybe more than traditionally liberal governments. Mark Carney has changed the definition of a liberal government in this country. And many have said that he could be aligned to somebody like Brian Mulroney and the Progressive Conservatives, more so than somebody like Justin Trudeau, who went the opposite direction with the Liberals. What are your thoughts? Good, bad, and how does caucus play into this, as this group of people who, many of whom sat in the Trudeau government, are now sitting in Mark Carney's government? How do you think that's impacting the caucus relations, Supriya?
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like you may have dated both yourself there by being young, Rachel, by saying that, because I only say that because I often say the same thing, that it's not really, may not be a typical liberal government, but I would just say that I think folks that are a touch older will be like, well, John Crutch, and there's Paul Martin, and then there's this and this.
Hey, I referenced Mulroney.
You did. But so I think he may just be reversion to the mean, I guess, like going back to, but I certainly take your point. I mean, for me, what I find interesting is that there are, a number of caucus members who, like, they're in the they text me regularly to complain. They text other people regularly to complain, but they're very good at keeping their lips zipped in public, right? Which is, I guess, how it should be when you're good at managing caucus relations and good at keeping everybody on side. And I think, right now, and this isn't specific to the Liberal caucus. I think most caucuses work this way, but your main concern is going to be polling over, policy or principles for the most part. So as long as Carney continues to poll well, both, personally as well as the Liberal Party generally, I think the progressive flank of caucus will keep their criticisms largely muted. So I certainly, there will eventually come a time where something happens and polls go down, and then I'd expect some of the more vociferous caucus members from, years past will once again start to become a little bit more noisy.
Power is really good for getting people to be quiet and keep to themselves. And if you look at when the Trudeau administration started having real problems with that, it was when, their poll numbers were not strong. And people felt that they, had more liberty or whatnot to go ahead and speak out. And that's not the dynamic right now. But I do think that, we talk a lot about conservatives having a big tent of diverse perspectives they need to manage. So too now, I think the Liberals find themselves in that dynamic with a prime minister who, again, didn't come up through traditional partisan politics. And yet is leading a group of people that have, are the ones knocking on doors and really, doing the hard work. So I think that that's something that's going to be, again, hard for him to manage. Back to your kind of original question, though, Rachel, in terms of, is this a conservative prime minister? I mean, I think conservatives would have to disagree. The only thing that comes to mind for me as being like, good job, Mark Carney, the carbon tax, which became so politically toxic that he's been a fool not to do it. So I don't know that that's necessarily conservative bona fides, placed in the prime minister. I would be more inclined to give him, props from the right side of the aisle if government spending wasn't at an all-time high outside of the pandemic, or if any of these projects were actually getting up off the ground and we were seeing job creation, we're seeing numbers go the other way, unfortunately. If the nature of people's household debt were changing or improving, right? We've got half of Canadians right now saying they're living paycheck to paycheck. So I don't really buy the, liberal in a suit equals conservative policy making. Yeah, he gets some credit for the carbon tax, but like what is he actually doing? Maybe some of the public sector efficiency stuff could be considered small c conservative, but again, that bloat was so bad that is it really conservative to reduce when things were at a record high? I'm not sure. So conservatives would definitely rightly, I think, argue that he is not true blue.
Let's move from policy to politics for a minute. What has surprised you most about his political instincts or lack thereof?
I am a little surprised at the treatment of media. I think it came up a little bit earlier. For somebody that has been around politics and in the public eye for so long, he seems to have a real disdain for the media or being asked questions. And again, I'm genuinely a little bit shocked that he's not better at kind of blocking and rolling for somebody that's so deep in their career and has been around high profile positions. He's been the governor of 2 banks, obviously, and has been around these circles. And I think that if we were in a different environment from a public opinion perspective, I wonder if that would be challenged a little bit more by the press in terms of just, how he treats them. The instance that comes to mind for me was he had that trip to China and India and Australia, and some very legitimate questions being asked about how much of a threat India does or does not play in terms of electoral interference with competing messages sent by government representatives. And despite dragging the press along, he didn't talk to them for the first 5 or 6 days of the trip. That is, I have to think that if the shoe were on the other foot, it were a different prime minister, let alone a different political party, that would be number one news. And you really saw the media not say much about it. So that has surprised me in terms of just how how ill prepared he seems to be to deal with kind of the nature of political media. And I wonder if that's maybe an Achilles heel.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The one that I would add, though, and I'm curious, Kate, what you think, is it because, do you think he was dealing mostly with financial press? So in like kind of like in the tech world, it's often very fawning coverage, and it's not really like, you're not really adversarial, not really like challenging somebody, right?
Yeah, and I think he's been used to being the boss for so long that like you don't question the boss.
Yeah.
And it's like there is an ultimate higher accountability when you're in the prime minister's chair than when you're, at Goldman Sachs, like, and you're running things there. So I just think it's a different level of transparency and accountability. I think some of the folks that he's bringing in from outside of government also might struggle with this, right? Like it is an adjacent position to politics. Your shareholder are the people of Canada, and the media are the avenue to the shareholder, right? So I just think that the translation from business to politics in terms of how they interface with the public hasn't really been made in the prime minister's case yet.
Yeah, if I was going to add to that, I would just say that, I'll open with I always tend to roll my eyes when conservatives are like, can you imagine if Harper did this? But one perfect example actually is, all the cuts that are being made to foreign aid. And if you look in particular what this government has said with respect to a feminist foreign policy, and has basically said that they're going to go back to the global gag rule when it comes to funding abortion and reproductive health services. If a conservative government did that, there'd be a whole heck of a lot more noise over it. And I find it surprising that in describing it and going through with this sort of policy, there wasn't any sort of like thinking of, well, is this going to end up, blowing up on us in some respect down the line, or will it, what do these cuts actually mean tangibly for stability of certain regions and et cetera. But I don't know, it's kind of niche, I guess, as a what grinds my gears topic.
We love things that grind your gears. Okay, crystal ball. 1 year from right now, what are you predicting will be Mark Carney's second year in office? The big headlines, the big policies, the big shifts. Like, what do you think we'll be talking about a year from now, Kate?
The two things for me are national unity and Canada-US trade, right? I'm not sure how much will be achieved on CUSMA in the lead up to July, because then we lose the US side on the other side of the table to their own election process. So if we're, March 2027, my God, I hope we have something approaching a stable trading relationship and agreement and environment so that we can convey to potential investors that we have that stability. That would be one thing for sure. But we've got a Quebec election in the fall. We've got a brewing succession sentiment in Alberta that's going to also come to a tipping point this year and probably bleed over into 2027, depending on how things go. The Prime Minister, I think, is going to have to really make some efforts to demonstrate what he's doing to get a handle on the division that exists regionally within Canada.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is probably affordability. So like if things don't get better, right, people are going to be pissed and they're going to want someone to blame. And unfortunately, even if there aren't a ton of levers within, the prime minister's purview that they can just sort of pull at, unless we're going to like communist style price controls or whatever, there isn't a lot that they can do. Right. But that doesn't matter if, interest rates are going up, or if we have a notion of more economic sort of uncertainty because of our relationship with the US, or if there's another like external kind of global calamity with respect to, I don't know, let's say the AI bubble bursting or getting some another war that's like, like there's a lot that can go wrong, essentially. I don't mean to sound like a doomer, but I just, with respect to how people's finances are working, I think that there's a lot that can, that we should be concerned with and cautious about. And so I think that will probably hit him. But just to touch on Kate's point about the national unity, I don't think people should sleep on the fact that if the Parti Québécois wins in Quebec, there will be another referendum. Like, he said it straight up, even though like it may not, let's say, get the rest of Canada thinking about it, but Quebec is certainly thinking about it. And to Kate's point about secessionist sentiment in Alberta, I mean, can you imagine if we had 2 separation questions in the country in the same year? Like, I don't know, like like leaving alone what that does for Canadians, think about how that makes us ripe for the picking for almost every single hostile state actor there is looking to mess with our democracy and to increase, polarization and division within us, within Canadians.
Well, we've come to the 30-minute mark. You've shared a lot of thoughts. You gave us a glimpse of what that report card could look like at the outset, and then you made some arguments in the middle. So now I'm curious, if you have to apply a grade to Mark Carney's first year in government, what is the grade?
And why?
Kate.
And why?
I'm feeling so generous. I'm going to give the Prime Minister, yes, very unusual. I'm going to give the Prime Minister a C. Because for Carney. No, can you imagine that was my rationale? No, I'm going to give him a C. I think that there are some things that have started to roll that if the government actually gets some of this off the ground, like Canada will be in a better position than we have been for some time in terms of these major projects and investments. And like, I genuinely am optimistic that we can get there. But there needs to be big changes, including a lot of winding down of legislation. That's a problem. And I think caucus dynamics make that difficult for the Prime Minister. But if we really want to see kind of the benefit of a lot of what's been initiated, we just have to move a lot faster and be much, much bolder. And so it's a C for me.
So I said from the onset that there's certain areas where I give him an A+, and then there's certain areas where he gets like barely passing. So with that, I think the mean tends to be around a B+, like a very high B+, at like a 78 or 79, but like a B+. And I think it's because of some of the domestic issues that I had talked about on the legislative side that I think is quite concerning.
Well, it's super interesting to have that recorded, your grades for Mark Carney, and to see next year where he will be, because we typically see big changes between the first and second years of government. And so hopefully we'll be giving him an A+ for renegotiating CUSMA and changing all of our affordability prospects and building every home in the country. So here's fingers crossed to that. But for now, we will leave it there. And thank you both so much for joining us. You're both absolutely brilliant, and it's such a pleasure to listen to you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We'll be right back.
Thank you for listening. New episodes air every Friday.
Subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram and find us at beyondaballot.com.